Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. Here we're doing the pregame review for the Sunday night game, which is Detroit at Kansas City. Looking into this matchup, you have Kansas City favored on the money line with a spread of 2.5 and a total line of 52.5. Detroit has a passing rank of 13, a rushing rank of 5, an allowed passing rank of 18, and an allowed rushing rank of 7, while Kansas City has a passing rank of 9, a rushing rank of 10, an allowed passing rank of 10, and an allowed rushing rank of 24. This comes out so that Detroit gets on average 238 passing yards per game, an average of 134.8 rushing yards per game. They've had a total of 2 interceptions this season, and on average they take less than 2 sacks per game. With Kansas City, you get 251.4 passing yards per game on average, and an average of 120 rushing yards per game. They also have had 2 passing interceptions this season, and they also on average take less than 2 sacks per game. On the defense side, Detroit allows 229 passing yards per game on average, and an average of 92.2 rushing yards per game. Kansas City averages almost 200 passing yards allowed per game, and they allow 123.4 rushing yards per game on average. Detroit also averages 3.2 defensive sacks per game and 6.2 QB hits per game, with 1.2 defensive interceptions per game, which comes out with a total of 6 interceptions on the season. On Kansas City's side, you average 2.2 sacks per game and 6.4 QB hits per game, and 0.8 interceptions per game, which comes out to 4 interceptions this season. Our quarterbacks in this matchup are Jared Goff on Detroit and Patrick Mahomes for Kansas City. Goff has had 90.4 fantasy points this season for an average of 18.1 fantasy points per game. Mahomes has 115.3 fantasy points this season, which comes out to just over 23 average fantasy points per game. Both of them have 2 passing interceptions, and Goff has suffered 8 sacks, and Mahomes with 7. Goff also has lost a fumble due to a sack. On average, Goff gets 237.4 passing yards per game and does not do much rushing, with only 1.8 rushing yards per game on average. Mahomes has 251.4 passing yards per game and averages 38 rushing yards per game. With Goff, you have his best week in week 2 with 334 passing yards, and his worst week was week 4 with 168. Mahomes had his best week last week with 318 passing yards, and his worst week in week 2 with 187. Otherwise, he's managed to stay over 200 passing yards for every other game, as has Goff, other than his one game. For our running backs, you have Gibbs on Detroit and Pacheco on Kansas City. Gibbs has 73.7 fantasy points this season. That's 95.7 in PPR, an average of 14.7 fantasy points per game, and 19.2 in PPR. Gibbs has a total of 73.7 fantasy points this season, 95.7 in PPR. That's an average of 14.7 fantasy points, or 19.1 in PPR. Pacheco's had 26.9 fantasy points, 35.9 in PPR, for an average of just under 5.4 fantasy points per game, or 7.2 in PPR. There are no turnovers between the two running backs. On average, Gibbs gets 65 rushing yards per game and an average of 22.4 receiving yards per game. Pacheco gets an average of 32.6 rushing yards per game and just under 10 receiving yards per game. The best week for Gibbs was week 2 with 94 rushing yards, but he also had a week 4 with 91 rushing yards, and his worst week was week 1 with 19 rushing yards. Pacheco, though, is a much more consistent one in that 30s and 20s, with his lowest being 22 and his highs being 45. For the number 1 receivers on each team, you have Amon-Ra St. Brown for Detroit and Xavier Worthy for Kansas City. Amon-Ra has 77.4 fantasy points this season, 112.4 in PPR. That's an average of 15.5 fantasy points, or 22.5 in PPR. Worthy's had 17.2 fantasy points, 28.2 in PPR. That's an average of 5.7 fantasy points, or 9.4 in PPR. There's also no turnovers between the two receivers. If we look at the averages, Amon-Ra gets 81.4 receiving yards on average per game, and Worthy's had almost 42 receiving yards per game on average. Worthy does get some more rushing, with 15.6 average rushing yards per game, and he averages a little bit more than 1 carry per game. That's a total of 4 carries for 47 yards on the season. And week by week, you have Amon-Ra's worst week with week 1 at 45 receiving yards. His best week was week 2 with 115 receiving yards, and he almost beat that last week with 100 receiving yards. Otherwise, he stayed about that mid-70s too. For Worthy, he had his average really brought down by that first week with 0 receiving yards, but then he came back in week 4 there and had 83 receiving yards, and last week with 42. For Amon-Ra, that's actually not the largest share for his team. It looks like Jameson Williams is. And with Kansas City, Xavier has a smaller part of the pie. It doesn't help that he missed a couple weeks. I believe that largest percentage right there is Tyquan Thornton. And just finishing up with the tight ends, you have Sam Laporta for Detroit and Travis Kelce for Kansas City. Sam Laporta has a total of 32.9 fantasy points this season. That's 53.9 in PPR. It's an average of just under 6.6 fantasy points, or 10.8 in PPR. Travis Kelce has 36.3 fantasy points, 58.3 in PPR, has an average of 7.2 per game, or 11.6 in PPR. Neither tight end has lost a fumble this season. Sam Laporta averages 53.8 receiving yards per game, while Kelce averages 48.6 receiving yards per game. That leaves Sam with his worst week at 26 receiving yards in week 2, and his best week was last week with 92 receiving yards, and that gives him about a 15% share of his team's receiving yards. For Kelce, his first week was week 3 with 26 receiving yards, and he has a tie for his best weeks as week 2 and week 5 with 61 receiving yards. His piece of the pie isn't quite showing up right, but that's got to be about another 7-8% of his team's receiving share. And there we have it for Sunday Night Football. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like and subscribe. Leave a comment on what else you want to see, if there's more to see. And otherwise, thank you so much for watching.